A woman who wrote over 100,000 pages about humility has been accused of pride. A prophet who openly denied her own infallibility has been charged with claiming divine perfection. Today, we're diving deep into Ellen G. White, how mischaracterizations distort her humility, why her own claims about inspiration actually counter plagiarism accusations, and how her Christ-centered ministry stood apart from 19th century religious leaders. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why human complexity doesn't disqualify someone from being used by God. So let's start with something that seems contradictory. How can someone who wrote extensively about humility be accused of pride?
That's exactly the kind of mischaracterization we need to unpack. According to the page content from her writings, Ellen White taught that those who have the deepest experience in the things of God are the farthest removed from pride and self-exaltation. She understood that true spiritual depth creates humility, not arrogance.
But where do these accusations of pride even come from?
It's fascinating. The page content shows she wrote that because they have an exalted conception of the glory of God, they feel that the lowest place in his service is too honorable for them. This is someone who saw herself as unworthy of even the smallest role in God's work.
That's a pretty radical view of humility. What examples did she give?
She pointed to biblical figures like Moses, who did not know that his face shone with a brightness that was terrifying to those who beheld after spending 40 days with God. And Paul, who called himself the chief of sinners despite being highly honored by the Lord.
So she's saying the closer you get to God, the more aware you become of your own shortcomings?
Exactly. And she included John the Baptist, who declared himself unworthy even to unloose his master's sandals, despite Jesus calling him the greatest of prophets. These weren't people with low self-esteem. They had accurate self-perception in light of God's greatness.
That's actually pretty profound. But let's shift to something that's dogged her legacy for over a century. The plagiarism accusations. Where did these even start?
According to the Ellen G. White estate documentation, the genesis of the plagiarism charge has been credited to former Adventist minister D.M. Canwright. His first published criticism appeared in the Michigan Christian Advocate on October 8, 1887.
What exactly was he claiming?
Canwright wrote that she often copies, without credit or sign of quotation, whole sentences and even paragraphs, almost word for word, from other authors. He specifically compared The Great Controversy with Dubim's History of the Reformation.
And this was 1887, so we're talking about accusations that are literally 125 years old?
Right. The page content notes, this has remained disputed over the past 125 years. But here's what's crucial, the implications of such usage for her claim of inspiration. That's where her own statements become really important.
How so? What did she actually claim about her inspiration?
This is where it gets really interesting. According to Spectrum magazine's analysis, Ellen White explicitly denied infallibility. She said, "We have many lessons to learn and many to unlearn. God and heaven alone are infallible."
Wait, she denied being infallible? That seems to undercut the plagiarism accusations entirely.
Exactly. She also said, in regard to infallibility, "I never claimed it. God alone is infallible." Someone claiming to receive direct, perfect revelation wouldn't need to use other sources or admit to human limitations.
So her own understanding of inspiration was more nuanced than her critics suggest?
Absolutely. The page content shows that Seventh-day Adventists recognize her as having prophetic authority because God granted her the biblical gift of prophecy, but they don't consider her writings an addition to or equal to the Bible.
That's a pretty important distinction. But let's talk about what made her ministry unique for her time. What set her apart from other 19th century religious leaders?
Her Christ-centered approach was distinctive. According to Bible Hub, central to her theology was the cosmic conflict between Christ and Satan, emphasizing that every individual is involved in a universal moral battle. This became known as the Great Controversy theme.
The Great Controversy theme, that sounds pretty comprehensive. How did this play out in her writings?
Her Conflict of the Ages series described her understanding of the role of God in biblical history and in church history. This narrative became foundational to Seventh-day Adventist theology. It wasn't just about individual salvation, it was about understanding all of history through the lens of this cosmic conflict.
And this was different from what other religious leaders were teaching at the time?
Very different. While many 19th century religious movements focused on specific doctrines or social reforms, Ellen White presented this overarching narrative that connected everything from Genesis to Revelation. Her book, The Desire of Ages, focused specifically on the life and ministry of Jesus.
Speaking of her impact, I noticed something interesting in the research. The Smithsonian named her among the 100 most significant Americans of all time. That's pretty remarkable for someone from the 19th century.
It really shows how her influence extended beyond religious circles. And get this, her grandson Arthur L. White wrote that she's the most translated female non-fiction author in the history of literature, as well as the most translated American non-fiction author overall.
That's incredible. Steps to Christ alone has been published in more than 140 languages. That puts it in pretty elite company with books like the Bible itself.
Right, and that global reach speaks to something universal in her message. But here's what I find most compelling. She consistently pointed people back to Scripture. She advised believers to consult Scripture as the final authority.
So even with her prophetic claims, she maintained that the Bible was the ultimate standard?
Absolutely. The page content shows her prophetic ministry consistently pointed people back to the Bible and made clear that the Bible is the standard by which all teaching and experience must be tested.
Now let's get to something that I think is really at the heart of this whole discussion. Can flawed, complex human beings be used by God? Because that seems to be what some of the criticism is really about.
This is where the biblical pattern becomes so clear. According to the page content, the Bible is full of individuals who made significant mistakes, yet were chosen by God for important roles.
Give me some examples. Who are we talking about?
Moses, who had a speech impediment and a history of murder. David, who committed adultery and orchestrated a man's death. Peter, who denied knowing Jesus 3 times. Yet all were used powerfully by God.
Those are some pretty serious flaws. What's the pattern here?
The page content notes that God's power and grace are not limited by human imperfection. Abraham lied about his wife Sarah to protect himself, yet he's called the father of nations. Jacob's name literally means deceiver, but God chose him to father the 12 tribes of Israel.
So the biblical precedent is actually that God uses flawed people?
More than that, the page content suggests that God, who knows the end from the beginning, knew these people were broken before he decided to use them. It's not despite their flaws, it's with full knowledge of them.
That's a pretty radical concept. What does this mean for how we should view Ellen White's humanity?
It means her human complexity doesn't disqualify her from divine calling. The page content shows there's even scholarly recognition of this. A 2022 Andrews University dissertation analysed how different interpreters handle the balanced tension in her writings.
What kind of tension are we talking about?
The dissertation by Cyril Marshall found that Ellen White's writings contain statements that can be interpreted different ways, and she needed elements from both categories to fully describe her teaching. This shows the complexity of trying to systematize any human's theological thoughts.
So even scholarly analysis recognizes that her writings reflect human complexity rather than mechanical perfection?
Exactly. And this actually aligns with her own understanding. Remember, she wrote about the need to humble yourself and not wait for God to humble you, and emphasized that vanity and pride fill the hearts of men, including, presumably, herself.
There's something really refreshing about that level of self-awareness. She's not claiming to be above the human condition.
Right. She wrote that it is painful to learn lessons of humility, yet nothing is more beneficial in the end. This sounds like someone speaking from personal experience, not theoretical knowledge.
And that brings us back to the original question about humility. Her critics seem to have missed the forest for the trees.
Absolutely. The page content shows she taught that true humility will lead a man to exalt Christ and the truth, and to realize his utter dependence upon the God of truth. That's not the language of someone claiming personal perfection.
You know what strikes me about all this? The plagiarism accusations seem to miss the point entirely about how inspiration actually works.
That's such an important insight. The page content shows that even biblical prophets like Nathan, whose books, though inspired, didn't become part of the biblical canon, were still authoritative. Inspiration doesn't require canonical status or perfect originality.
And the authority comes from the inspiration itself, not from meeting modern standards of citation?
Exactly. The page content notes that the authority of a prophet is based on his or her inspiration, and the authority of the prophet's writings is based on their inspiration, not on their place in the canon. It's about the divine calling, not the human methodology.
This really reframes the whole debate. Instead of asking whether Ellen White was perfect, we should be asking whether God can use imperfect people.
And the biblical answer is overwhelmingly yes. The page content reminds us that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Moses argued with God about his speaking ability, yet became one of history's greatest leaders.
So when you step back from all the accusations and mischaracterizations, what emerges is actually a pretty consistent picture.
Right. Someone who understood her own limitations, pointed people to Christ and Scripture, and whose ministry followed the biblical pattern of God using flawed humans for divine purposes. Her humility wasn't false modesty, it was genuine self-awareness.
And her claims about inspiration actually support rather than contradict this view. She never claimed to be a perfect conduit.
Exactly. Her Christ-centered ministry stood apart from her contemporaries precisely because it acknowledged human frailty while pointing to divine strength. That's what made it so powerful and enduring.
Here's what this really comes down to. The mischaracterizations of Ellen White reveal more about our discomfort with complexity than they do about her actual character or calling.
That's beautifully put. We want our religious figures to be either perfect saints or complete frauds. But the biblical pattern shows God consistently choosing people who are neither, just willing.
And Ellen White's own writings show she understood this. Her humility wasn't a character flaw to overcome, it was the very thing that made her useful to God.
Right. When she wrote that workers with true humility enter upon their work, not with boasting or self-sufficiency, but with full assurance of faith, she was describing her own approach to ministry.
So the next time someone brings up the old accusations about Ellen White, remember this. Her own words about humility, her explicit denial of infallibility, and her Christ-centered focus tell a very different story than her critics suggest.
And remember that the biblical pattern supports exactly this kind of complex, humble, yet powerfully used servant of God. Human complexity doesn't disqualify divine calling, it's actually part of the pattern.
Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. The next time you encounter someone whose humanity seems to complicate their spiritual authority, you'll know you're looking at something deeply biblical, God's preference for using broken people to accomplish perfect purposes.